Good evening. Welcome to Vishwa Pragna channel.
Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you, Lawyer Karu. So today we are going to, yeah, so today we are going to do a reading of the third chapter of A History of Economics, the Past as the Present by John Kenneth Galbraith. So the first two chapters we already finished. The first one was called A Look at the Landscape. The second one, After Adam. The third chapter that we are going to read today is called The Enduring Interim. Okay, so with that, I'm going to get into the chapter itself, and then we'll see what what Galbraith is saying about the enduring interim. All right, let's see. Let me turn to this page, and then we can get going. Okay, so although not recognized as a part of the historical tradition of economic thought, the Roman commitment to the sanctity of private property, as it would now be called, was a tremendous legacy to economic and political life. So the Romans were very committed to the idea of private property. It was to be the source of innumerable peasant uprisings against the power of landlords, excuse me, and aristocrats, and eventually of the greatest social revolution of modern times. The socialist revolt against the power and the ability to win submission that accompany or once accompanied the possession of industrial and also landed property. Looks like somebody entered. Sikshardin Garu is here. So we'll add
So,
him to the stage, and then Sikshardin Garu, you have to wait for a couple of minutes. When there is a logical break, I will give it to you. Okay. Socialist
um,
revolt against power and the ability to win submission that accompany or once accompanied the possession of like industrial property or also landed property. There was another. So this concept of the sanctity of private property that was patronized by the Romans gave rise to this eventual social revolt, is what Galbraith is saying. There was another, perhaps yet greater legacy from the Roman era, if not specifically from Rome. So, Roman, which included greater Rome, not just Rome, and that was Christianity. All right. This building on and vastly extending the earlier Judean tradition, law, and teaching had three enduring effects. So, three enduring effects of Christianity on economics. All right. One was achieved through the example it established, one through the social beliefs and attitudes it inculcated, and one through the specific economic laws it supported or required. So, what were the three? The example it established, the social beliefs and attitudes, and the third one through specific economic laws. So, these were the three enduring effects of Christianity. The example was that of Jesus, the son of an artisan or a carpenter as we know it now, who showed that there was no divine right of the privileged. Power could be with people who worked with their hands. Accompanied by disciples who were mostly of similar humble background, Jesus challenged the Herodian establishment and therewith the greatly more majestic power of Rome. So Herodian means what? Herod. Herod was one of the kings during the biblical times. That one person or one small group from such origins, that one such that what that one person or one small group from such origins could gain such influence, distinction, and authority was an example to be cited, an influence to be felt for the next 2000 years. So, a commoner achieving some kind of a divine um, um, place in the divine pantheon or whatever you want to call it, right? Divinity is something that was unheard of before, because logic would have it that they would be part of the kingly or the royalty. In this case, it was not. So that is the first time. Those who in later times entered a protest against the established economic order would be called rabble rousers, and it would be part of their defense that in his assault, H capital, on the Jerusalem establishment, in denigrative terms, the money changers and the usurers of the temple. So who revolted against his capital H is Jesus here, right? So rabble rousers would quote the example of Jesus saying, Jesus was not too kind to the Jewish establishment that managed the church in Jerusalem. He referred to it in denigrative terms. He referred to them as money changers and usurers. Usury is like greed, basically, right? Or specifically giving money out for interest. So, uh, part of the defense was that Jesus was their ultimate role model, basically, because he assaulted the establishment. To a far greater extent than many conservative Christians have liked to think, he, being Jesus, legitimized revolt against evil or oppressive economic power. Wonderful. So the social movement used Jesus Christ as an icon of somebody who can raise from the common people and then challenge the establishment and potentially even um, start something of some kind of a revolution, not just a rabble rousing. That priests in Central America who joined the people in opposing rapacious or corrupt authority today believe themselves to be acting according to his example. Jesus' example is a cause even now of much reputable distress. Okay, so all these people, rebels, the priests in Central America, for example, are also using Jesus, and that is a cause for a lot of distress. The principal social attitude perpetuated by Christianity supported the equality of all mankind, all being children of God, or at least on paper. Okay, the marketing document said this. All were, in consequence, equals in the brotherhood of man. In keeping with this instruction was an inevitable suspicion of wealth as a differentiation between brothers, um, a source for some of unequal power, prestige, and enjoyment. So, viewing extreme amount of wealth as something that prevents the brotherhood from actually manifesting, and hence it's not something that is to be seen positively. By slight extension, there was also a sense of the superior virtue of the poor. Obviously and persistently troubling questions followed as to the institution of slavery and further questions as to the wealth and pursuit of wealth. So much so that some special distinction would henceforth accrue to the Christian who took a vow of poverty. So, why is it economically important? Um, Purity was associated with a Christian who took a vow of poverty, basically. So, if you're poor, there is an associated or a correlation between how poor you are and how much virtue you have. Okay, so very interesting correlation. For the next 2 millennia, down to modern times, the great Christian slave owner and the devout man of wealth would have need to find special theological support for their good fortune, support that would frequently be available at some modest cost. Indeed, by the time of the Renaissance, popes by the time of the Renaissance popes, the church itself would have become reconciled to the accumulation of wealth by its priests. So it completely turned, right? From those times when they thought the poor were associated with virtue, now the church itself became an institution that somehow provided some kind of a reconciliation or justification to accumulate wealth, including the priests, of course, the papacy. Indulgences would be marked in an orderly manner. Churchly offices would have their going price. The rich, once held to have difficult access to heaven, would now enter in an expeditious way as their solvent survivors purchased a prompt passage for them through purgatory, or a design that must have caused a serious congestion of the righteous poor in that inhospitable station. So essentially, the rich could buy their way to heaven. That was the reconciliation, and the poor would not have it, or there is no expedient way of getting to heaven. So you would be stuck in the general compartment, basically. To be very fair, there is it's similar, not too dissimilar to some of the Indian temples where you get, if you pay more, you get faster view of the deity, right? Nevertheless, let's not compare things. Let's see them as they are. Nonetheless, Christian attitudes towards both wealth and equal standing of all men before God have survived such aberrations. I see. With the Reformation, they were affirmed by those by the thesis of Martin Luther, as also in the later and improved standards of the Church of Rome. So, the Protestant movement led by Martin Luther challenged some of these aberrations. That's what the author is saying. And as a result, the Church of Rome also had to reform itself, more or less along the lines of the Protestant movement, if not theologically, at least all these additional economic and other wealth accumulation and all that were curbed a little bit. Along with a notably convenient accommodation to earthly needs, preferences, and pleasures, there would be an accompanying persistence of original Christian doctrines calling for the rejection of worldly, meaning pecuniary concerns. The most specific relation of Christianity to economics centered on the laws pertaining to the taking of interest. Interest means basically the interest you get in your savings account, right? You accumulate money and you keep it in one place, then it accumulates interest, right? Labor as a factor of production was considered to be good. Jesus and the apostles spoke proudly of toil. The laborer was believed worthy of his hire, and the returns to the landowner were not severely criticized. But early Christian doctrine strongly condemned the exaction of interest, or the what do you call it, the imposition of interest when somebody lends money, basically, right? As with the Greeks, it was seen as extortion by the fortunately affluent from the unfortunate, unwise, or impoverished, who were pressed by the needs and obligations beyond their means. That money might be borrowed so that the borrower could make more money from it, still had no effective standing in Roman times, and did not sanction the taking of interest. The need to find a justification for interest would, in fact, preoccupy some of the most innovative minds for the next 1800 and more years, right? The money lender for all this time would be a dubious, even reprehensible figure. And if a Jew and thus more ambiguously subject to the ban on taking of interest, he would be a ripe object for anti-Semitism. Okay, so long, like a very long sentence, but essentially what he's saying here is, if somebody charged interest, they would be looked down upon not so kindly, and if it were a Jew, then he would be doubly seen with suspicion, right? So we have this Shakespearean play called Merchant of Venice, right? In that, the person who lends the money, the character himself is actually a Jewish person, Shylock the Jew, basically, right? And he plays his part by being extremely mean. One far from impeccable view used the Christian restriction on the taking of interest to accord to the Jews a central role in the early development of capitalism, a thesis that sadly minimizes the ability of the Christian doctrine to adjust to economic need and the signal importance of Christians, the Fuggers, Imhoffs, and the Welsers among the great early moneylenders of Europe. So here I have to take a 1 minute sidetrack and talk about what theory Galbraith is talking about, and then I'll give it to Sikshardhan Garu, basically, right? So there is a thesis that whenever the Christians occupied a land or when they carried out their crusades, they would actually call some Jewish people to set up these lending agencies that would lend money for interest, because it was not seen very kindly by the uh, Christians, lending of money for interest, right? However, the author is arguing the alternative point of view, which is, it so happened that there were some Jews that were brought in to manage the money. It was more coincidence because there were enough adjustments in the Christian doctrine that considered lending money not a sin, right? Basically, you can call it like, if you think of the puritanical sense, the Christian church was already corrupt enough to accept interest as a legitimate form of making money, basically, right? So the fact that Jews played a central role, because the Christians were too, they viewed taking interest as sin, is a fallacious argument. It's a fallacy, basically, is what the author is saying. And there are enough counterexamples where Christians were the lenders, not the Jews. That's what he's saying. Okay, sir. I'll take a pause here.
All right, sir. Thank you, sir. Yes. So let's continue.
So, do you know where to start?
Yes, sir. I've been
Yeah, the
following.
Christian doubts. Yeah.
The Christian doubts as to the righteousness of money lending have never been wholly expunged. As noted in the last chapter, the loan shark is, to this day, outside the boundaries of conventional respectability, and only in relatively recent times have bankers been safely within. In the last century and on into the present one, John Pierpont Morgan, the most prominent of American bankers, established himself as a highly visible pillar of the Protestant Episcopal Church
Hang on, sir.
by
Just the 10-second
sorry.
intervention. So you know who that is, right? Who they are referring to? J.P. Morgan.
Oh, all right, sir.
Yep.
John
JPMC, still one
Pierpont
of the
Morgan.
most important banks in the US. JP
Yes,
Morgan
yes,
Chase, it's called.
yes, yes, sir. A very famous name. Right. To the present one, John Pierpont Morgan, the most prominent of American bankers, established himself as a highly visible pillar of the Protestant Episcopal Church by, among other things, according according the hospitality of his private railroad car to bishops and divines as they moved back and forth to church meetings. Some thought this a design for countering an otherwise predatory image as the greatest moneylender of his age. Historians have looked earnestly and with little success for any formal expression of economic ideas in the scholarly and priestly thought of the 1000 years that followed the dissolution of the Roman Empire. The yield has again, as with the Greeks and Romans, been slight. And again, the reason is not hard to find. The basic economic life of the Middle Ages bore little resemblance to modern economic society. Accordingly, there was little that, as economics is now regarded, needed describing. Specifically, the market, though growing in importance with the passing centuries, was a minor aspect of life. The great rural masses of men and women grew, made or killed what they ate or wore, and surrendered a part of it to a hierarchy of lords or masters for their right to do so and their protection while thus engaged. As workers in the fields and cottages, peasants could be slaves, serfs, freeholders, sharecroppers, or tenants. They might have as their overlords the church, the king, the king, great noblemen, gentry of higher and lesser degree, or rich tenant farmers. But whatever the relationship between master and worker, whether one of the traditional status, obligation, or compulsion, products and services were surrendered, not sold, were surrendered, not sold. This being so, this being the social situation of overwhelming proportion of all people, it would be astonishing had there been any developed set of economic ideas as there are as they are now understood. What was important once again was the intrusion of ethics on economics, the fairness or justice of the relationship between master and slave, lord and serf, landlord and sharecropper. A determining factor as regards income was the feudal conflicts or alliances by which one feudal lord enlarged his landed territory and thus his revenues at the expense of another. It is appropriately of these conflicts and not of the economic nexus that the established history deals. It might be added that this relation of landed territory to income has had an enduring effect on political and military thought. To this day, the intellectually more retarded military strategist looks at a frontier on a map with, with the assumption that some landed feudatory has designs for bursting out to appropriate the acres and revenues across the border. That to seize and operate successfully a modern industrial economy is a more difficult task than simply to annex one's neighbor's land is a matter that has yet fully to penetrate the established military mind. As a ruling circumstance, however, the absence of trade or market in the Middle Ages must not be carried too far. There were now towns, if minuscule by later standards, and the higher feudatories had diverse needs or desires that were served by traders from near and far, or satisfied by purchase from the craftsmen of the local guilds. Here indeed was a market, but not being the norm of everyday relationships. It did not attract major attention or thought. Economics in all Economics in all modern manifestations centers on the market. In a world in which the market was a subsidiary, even esoteric, aspect of life, economics as now known still did not exist. Once again, however, there were expectations. Such purchases and sales as did
That
occur,
would be exceptions.
exceptions, sorry, sir. Once again, however, there were exceptions. Such purchases and sales as did occur attracted the mind and pen of the greatest of the religious philosophers of his millennium, the wonderfully prolific Saint Thomas Aquinas, or Thomas of Aquina, 1225 to 1274, an Italian-born citizen of France and indeed of all Europe. He was the first of the group of religious philosophers and scholars known to history as the schoolmen. And money, the most magically alluring subject of economics, drew the attention of another unusually articulate divine, Nicole Oresme, the Bishop of Lisieux.
No, Liso.
Lisieux,
Liso.
all right, sir. Lisieux. As as markets in the Middle Ages were only a small part of the structure of everyday life, so also they had their special characteristics. Many sales, as of a horse or of cattle, were from one man to another, or they were by one or a handful of merchants to others, or they were under the regulation of the sellers of the product of the guilds. The latter, the craft guilds, were a strongly characteristic feature of medieval economic life. They existed for many purposes: assurance as to quality of workmanship, highly agreeable social observances, political influence, and notably, if not always successfully, regulation of prices and journeymen's wages. Exceptional rather than normal in all medieval contexts was the impersonally determined or competitive market price. In all but the rarest cases, there was evidence of superior and inferior bargaining power, a greater or lesser measure of monopoly power. This being so, the question of the fairness or justice of the price arose, just as it had with Aristotle and as it does in modern times, when monopoly is involved. As it was to the fairness of the prices that St. Thomas Aquinas addressed himself, I answer that it is wholly sinful to practice fraud for the express purpose of selling a thing for more than its just price. To sell dearer or to buy cheaper than a thing is worth is in itself unjust and unlawful. A fair price was thus enjoined as a religious obligation. Default therefrom made the perpetrator subject not only to the moral condemnation of the community, but to appropriate a religious sanction, if not in this world, then in the next. The concept of the just price survives, as I have indicated earlier, in the everyday reference to what is fair, reasonable, or decent in a price as established in individual negotiation and by implication in the condemnation of the profiteer, predator, exploiter, or unduly grasping seller or buyer. What was never decided by St. Thomas, at least in any usefully secular way, is how a just price is determined. This too remains a matter on which the views of even righteous buyers and sellers have a wholly uncontrollable tendency to diverge. It cannot be supposed that it was a problem particularly welcomed by God, to whom St. Thomas and the other schoolmen ultimately referred it. Here, then is the greatest dialectic of economic life, that between morality and the market. The latter has been invoked over the centuries since Saint Thomas with even greater theological emphasis than the former. Leave it to the market. I only charge what the market will bear. And with such reiteration, the market has triumphed. St. Thomas Aquinas' just price has become a theological curiosity, not something that even a devout theologian takes seriously. And the market has acquired a powerful morality of its own. You don't interfere with the market. One is entitled to a fair market price. Yes, if exegiously the notion of a higher order of justice than that of the market has also survived. A legislated minimum wage is seen as a necessary manifestation of such justice, as are minimum farm prices, a fair price to the producer, and controlled rents in New York and other large cities. All these, in one established modern view, are greatly at odds with the efficiency of the market. They remain, nonetheless, as a distant, perhaps very distant, echo of the teachings of the schoolmen. St. Thomas' just price, as noted, was highly subjective. On some other matters, however, he was wholly objective. Thus, in considering the question of whether a seller can or should sell a defective product, he affirmed that he must not knowingly do so, and if some defective item is innocently passed along, the seller must compensate the buyer when the fault is discovered. As to whether a seller is bound to admit to an imperfection in an otherwise acceptable product, he must, of course, do so unless the defect is obvious as in the case of a horse with only one eye. St. Thomas is a relevant guide to the recent agitation in the United States as to whether a used car dealer should be required to post a list of the known defects in the vehicles he displays for sale. A bent fender would not need to be listed. A defective carburetor or transmission, according to St. Thomas' rules, would have to be made known. St. Thomas also accepted and indeed strongly affirmed the ban on the taking of interest and combined this with consideration of the righteousness of trade in general. His condemnation of trade was not total. There are two kinds of exchange. One may be called natural and necessary, by means of which one thing is exchanged for another, or things for money to meet the needs of life. The other kind of exchange is that of money for money, or of things for money, not to meet the needs of life, but to acquire gain. The first kind of exchange is praiseworthy because it serves natural needs, but the second is justly condemned. With these words, professional traders, brokers, scalpers, speculators, middlemen joined money lenders in moral obloquy. Here too, here too, a long process of rehabilitation would be required. In France in the 18th century, the physiocrats of whom the chapter after of whom the chapter after next will tell, uh, of whom the chapter after next will tell, would find trade essentially barren, unproductive of any real wealth. And to this day, when we think of wealth creation, there is a tendency to associate it with the production of hard, saleable goods. Buying and selling and the rendering of services have no similar standing. Also, the trader was, until recent times, subjected to some social stigma, this being the fate of anyone in trade in Britain until well into this century. Somerset Maugham, who, who was reared as an orphan in a clerical family, wrote eloquently, eloquently of his uncle's sense of generosity when, as a country minister, he admitted to the graces of the church a retailer or other tradesman. One cannot but assume a sea change in attitudes in the 100 years that separated the world of St. Thomas from that of Nicole Oresme.
Sir, hang on. So
All
let me
right.
take it from here. Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
So there are only like 3 pages, right? Okay. So now we are heading into the from St. Thomas. We are going to OS basically, right? Okay.
Yes, sir.
So one cannot but assume a sea change in attitudes in 100 years that separate the world of St. Thomas from that of OS basically. Marginal and suspect in the thought of St. Thomas, trade, merchant capitalism is central to that of OS. So OS focused on something else that St. Thomas did not focus on, right? It was marginal in St. Thomas's concept, but OS made it central. The policy of the prince should now be to encourage trade and arrange the conditions that do so. For OS, this meant principally the proper management of money, basically. It's not wholly an act of imagination to call him the first of the monetarists. So, who is a monetarist? Somebody who pays attention to the money flow in a society, right? So, for example, a present day monetarist would be Paul, right? Or Alan Greenspan or Janet Allen, for example, right? The chairman of the Federal Reserve. Tracing briefly the history of money, he showed how the coinage of gold, silver, and copper, coins of fixed weight and reliable purity, replaced the awkward, tedium of hoarding of the metal. The responsibility for coinage he
Excuse me,
then
sir.
placed, sir.
Sir, your voice gotten a bit low, sir.
Hang on,
No, it's okay. Right.
hang on 1 second. Let me check. Okay,
Yeah, now it is a little
so
low. Yes.
okay, now better.
Yeah, go ahead, sir. Seems to
Okay,
be.
Okay, sir.
yeah, the responsibility for coinage he then placed squarely on the prince, the government. So coins have to be made by the government so that people don't have to worry about these scales and all these things. Having imposed this responsibility, he devoted many pages and the most urgent of language to telling the prince of his further duties. Above all, he must not debase, right? OSM word is altered, the pure metal content of the coin, and this injunction was frequently repeated. So you should not muck around with the purity of the coin. That's what OSM used to say. Who then would trust a prince who would diminish the weight or finesse of money bearing his own stamp? Again, there are three ways, in my opinion, in which one may make profit from money aside from its natural use. Natural use is just for exchange. The first of these is the art of exchange, the custody of or trafficking in money. The second is usury. The third is the altering of money. The first is base, the second is bad, the third is even worse, he said. All right. So if you hoard money, it is bad. The second is if you um, lend it for interest, he said it is bad. The first is base, the second is bad. And then third is altering money, which is you change the purity of the metal. That is, the third is even worse. And it is sovereign's function, the government's function, to condemn and punish counterfeiters and those who practice any fraud upon money. How ashamed he should be, therefore, to be found guilty of a crime which he should punish in another by a disgraceful death. Owen was particularly severe with the prince of an adjacent realm who slipped debased coins into the monetary circulation of his neighbor. In other words, printing counterfeit money and introducing it into the society. He said it is one of the worst sins. And he was convinced that merchants would avoid doing business in a land where the coinage was unreliable. Good, reliable money is good for business. That's what Owen said. Copper having become too plentiful in Owen's day, he was for a coinage based on gold and silver. Because it is too plentiful, you can get counterfeit, right? He also called it bimetallism. For the purposes of everyday transactions, there should be a fixed ratio between the two. He mentioned, by way of illustration, ratios of 20 in weight of silver to 1 of gold. So 1 gold coin is to 20 silver coins, or 25 of silver to 3 of gold, slightly different ratio, more gold. The latter a considerably more favorable ratio for silver than the cry of 16 to 1 that rallied the American West at the end of the last century, I believe. He recognized that changes in supply of silver and gold would require changes in the ratio, but he pleaded that it be altered only in response to significant increases or decreases in that supply. In economics, there are some, even if not many, immutable laws. Immutable means laws that don't change with time. For example, loss of an order of certainty of Calvin Coolidge's possible apocryphal dictum that when many people are out of work, unemployment results. So, what was Coolidge's dictum? He said something very simple, right? Very obvious, but very profound, I guess. When many people are out of work, he said unemployment results. Okay, fair enough. Of comparable stature is Gresham's law that bad money drives out good, that people and enterprises of all stations, if they are possessed of money, some of which is of solid substance and reputation, and some that is debased or otherwise suspect, will pass on the bad and keep the good. All right. Thus, so all these dictums, obvious statements that were not directly present in economics, but people came and made those statements to make it very clear as to how to think about money, right? Does the bad derive the good from circulation? This law is attributed to Sir Thomas Gresham, the great Elizabethanian merchant, financier, diplomat, and one of the founders of the Royal Exchange. It is one of the major misattributions of history. Oehsma observed the tendency a full 2 centuries earlier, and it is unlikely that even he was the first. For it is this kind of economic discovery that anyone can make for himself or for herself. Should one have, as of this writing, a stock of Mexican pesos and a stock of American dollars or Swiss francs, there is little doubt as to which a mentally viable person would dispose of for current needs and which he or she would hold for the future, right? So some money is better than the other money. That's what essentially the author is getting at. And noticing that everyone did the same thing, someone would surely assert it as a law. The great truisms of economics have no clear discoverers. They are evident for all to see. So this is the truism of Galbraith himself, right? He's saying that if you have any common sense, then you would know that a gold coin is more valuable than silver. An American dollar is more valuable than a franc, and that is more valuable than a peso, basically, right? A Mexican peso. It remains that where a choice possible, the law attributed to Sir Thomas Grisham should better be attributed to Bishop, Bishop of Lesso. There was more in this great span of time than the words of St. Thomas and Ohes, but not much. And the reason will be evident. Economics, to repeat, does not exist apart from the relevant economic life. The rigid hierarchical structure of feudal society commanded and distributed goods and services not in response to price, but in response to law, custom, and the fear of condign and markedly painful punishments. So there was punitive law that made people to work and produce goods, services, and distribute them. It was not a free, what do you call, market as we see it today. The market was an esoteric exception. So he said, right, it was marginal. There were some exceptions where the market used to come into picture, but otherwise it was mostly one person forcing another person to do something under the um, uh, under the uh, iron boot of a very oppressive law. Okay, uh, the market was an esoteric exception. On it, scholars, not surprisingly, did not dwell because it was irrelevant, or it was mostly irrelevant. Ohes, who did, was responding to a new and expanding world in which markets and money were strongly emergent. To that world and the economic ideas it nurtured, we now turn. So, in the third chapter, the author lays out like his foundation of Saint Thomas, the uh, the Christian view of interest, right? Taking interest on a loan and things like that, and Ohes the concepts of currency, money. What is the role of the prince in governing a particular piece of land, etc., etc., right? And Ohes was responding to a new and expanding world in which free markets and money were strongly emergent. So his rules applied to these new concepts. So the fourth chapter, which we'll be reading in the next session, will focus on these ideas, right? And the fourth chapter is called The Merchants and the State. With that, we close chapter 3. Sir, any questions?
No, sir. Uh, just enjoyed reading and listening to you as well, sir. And how the system of economics is unfolding and evolving. Yes.
Yeah, it is quite fascinating because we are reading Western philosophy on one side, and we are also reading the history of economics, mostly obviously shaped by the Western world, right? So you can see the parallels as they come together.
Correct, sir.
Yeah. All right. So I
Uh,
think with that we can close, sir. If there's nothing to discuss. More to come, more to discover. Yeah. So Dr. Sai Kiran Garu is asking a question. Let's address this. So basically, foundational principles of the USA are against the economic principles of Christianity. No, sir. You should think of it the other way. The original, the puritanical form of Christianity, because it partially evolved, because it came from Judaism, used to look at money being circulated for interest as a sin, right? However, by the time the free markets and everything, all these concepts came in, even pre-industrial revolution, the church had made enough concessions on this idea of giving out money for interest that to a very large extent Christianity had absorbed this idea as a fait accompli, basically, right? So they had made enough accommodations to sort of adjust for this. So technically it is not. However, the Protestant side came in and then they tried to revive some of the puritanical things. But even otherwise, by then this whole concept of interest taking is sin had more or less died on the vine, so to speak, basically. And then this concept that whenever the crusades were done and a new land was acquired, the Christian conquerors would bring in a Jewish person or a group of Jews in order to establish a bank, in order to circulate the money and all that, is without foundation, basically. That's what the author is arguing here. All right, sir. Let's close. So thank you very much to all the viewers, all the participants who posted comments, and whoever is going to see the stream in the future. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. But overall, thank you very much, and I hope you are enjoying this as much as we are, because we are having a wonderful time. Goodbye, and see you in the next reading.